Good afternoon, I'm Chris Sanachkite. Welcome to APTN National News. 4 people have been arrested after more than $500,000 in drugs were seized in the Walpole Island First Nation in Ontario, located south of Sarnia. On Friday, October 18th, several police agencies, including the Lambton OPP and Walpole Island Police Service, issued a search warrant at an address on Walpole Island. Once inside, police seized fentanyl, methamphetamine, firearms, and hundreds of dollars in Canadian currency. 4 people, all from Walpole Island First Nation and all ranging from 25 years old to 33 years old, have been charged with careless storage of a firearm, prohibited device or ammunition, and possession of the purpose of trafficking meth and fentanyl. The 4 people are now in custody and already appeared in court before the Ontario Court of Justice in Sarnia. On Thursday, there was an emergency alert in northern Saskatchewan in the Prince Albert area. RCMP from multiple detachments were on scene searching for 3 to 4 suspects who shot someone north of Prince Albert while stealing a vehicle early Thursday morning. The initial alert said the men were traveling in a white 2020 Dodge Ram 1500 crew cab and then were believed to be on foot heading north on Highway 123 toward Cumberland House. RCMP have since arrested a man and a woman in the Tobin Lake area, but continue to search for 2 more suspects that are believed to be on foot. The emergency alert has since been called off, but if the situation becomes a risk to public safety, a new alert will be sent out. Residents in the Tobin Lake area will notice increased police presence while the search continues. Businesses and residents with security cameras between Holbein, Nipawin, and the Thunder Rapids area are being asked to search for footage of a black Honda CRV with 3 to 4 suspects dressed in all black with bandanas over their faces between October 23rd and the morning of October 24th. And on Thursday afternoon, a somewhat similar incident, but this time in Manitoba. A man was shot by RCMP, and Manitoba's Independent Investigations Unit is now looking into what happened in the Interlake region. This was part of the RCMP chase in St. Martin, Manitoba. On Thursday, October 24th, Gypsumville RCMP say they located a vehicle that had been stolen in Thompson overnight and was involved in a series of criminal activities. Police tried to stop the vehicle on Highway 6 just south of Pinnamutang First Nation. The driver refused to pull over, and after a short pursuit, the suspect stopped on Highway 6, and the male exited the vehicle with a firearm and attempted to carjack a stopped car. At this time, an officer discharged the firearm, striking the male suspect. The man then got into the stopped car and drove a short distance before coming to a stop in the ditch and was taken into custody. The 39-year-old man from Thompson was transported by Stars to a hospital with serious injuries. Manitoba's IIU is now investigating. A woman's halfway house for those involved with the justice system was opened in Whitehorse just last year, but a year and a half later, its doors have temporarily closed. Sarah Connors tells us why.
This women's halfway house in Whitehorse was hailed as the first of its kind in the north when it opened in early 2023. But now, the building sits empty. The government-funded Dakini Haven Women's Home, located next door to the Whitehorse Correctional Center, was operated by the nonprofit Connective. It has space for up to 8 women transitioning through or out of the criminal justice system, like those on supervised release. Earlier this month, Yukon Health and Social Service Minister Tracy Ann McPhee told the territorial legislature that the program had been put on pause at the end of September. She said 7 women were enrolled in the program, but all but 1 had left to deal with their issues elsewhere. She said the program wasn't very successful and that putting it on pause was the right course of action.
We have a facility at Dakini Haven that can house people.
However, the Council of Yukon First Nations Executive Director Shadell Chambers disagrees.
This program ending and really impacts Indigenous women.
The council partnered with Connective to provide cultural supports for the program because Indigenous women are overrepresented in the justice system.
It's really important that we do have a program available for women so that they have an option other than incarceration. So they have opportunities to connect with their children, attend programming in the community, and get access to supports and services.
McPhee says the government is evaluating connective supportive housing programs, including the women and men's halfway house programs. The evaluation will determine whether or not the programs are effective and meeting outcomes. The evaluation is expected to be completed by February 2025. Sarah Connors, APTN National News, Whitehorse.
The National Indigenous Collaborative Housing Incorporated, or NICHI, announced the recipients for the critical need for safe and affordable housing projects in Atlantic Canada. Indigenous Services Canada will provide over $33 million to fund 6 projects on the East Coast, including the Taiwok Housing Association in Nova Scotia, the Native Council of PEI, and Happy Valley Goose Bay. The funds will be distributed by NICHI, an Indigenous-led national housing organization. It supports urgent Indigenous-led housing needs in rural, urban, and northern areas. According to the 2021 Canada Census, over 170,000 Indigenous people live off reserve across Canada who need housing. The Atlantic recipients were just one of several announcements made this week across Canada, totaling almost $300 million in funding. It is supposed to build more than 3,800 housing units over the next 2 years. Until 1960, Status First Nations people in Canada were not permitted to vote in provincial or federal elections. Now, during the provincial election in Saskatchewan, the new Democratic Party is urging the Indigenous community to go out and vote. Saskatchewan's official opposition party, the NDP, announced a commitment to work with First Nations and Métis leaders to implement Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls to action and missing and murdered Indigenous women final reports on a provincial level. Betty Nippy Albright, the NDP candidate for Saskatoon City Centre, is seeking re-election. She notes that Indigenous people did not see themselves represented in the legislature in previous elections. Issues affecting them were ignored. This time, she is representing Indigenous peoples and their issues at the provincial level. Nippy Albright calls the Indigenous voting population a sleeping giant that must be awakened.
This is an opportunity to make your voice matter, to tell the governments that your voice will no longer be muzzled, it will no longer be ignored, and that the issues that you bring up and that you're impacted by will be raised.
Voting week has already begun in Saskatchewan with polls open till October 28th, which is Election Day. But a reminder, polls will be closed on the 27th. It is very rare when a United States president makes an apology. Today, that apology will be made to Indigenous people in the U.S. We'll tell you more when we come back in about 3 minutes. Stay with us. Welcome back. Today, U.S. President Joe Biden is expected to formally apologize for the United States' role in the Indian boarding school system, a system that the United Nations defined as, quote, an element of genocide against Indigenous people. According to the United States Interior Department, at least 973 Native American children died in those institutions, with that number expected to rise as its investigation continues in the years to come. From 1819 to 1969, the United States forcibly removed more than 18,000 Native American children, some as young as 4 years old, from their home. They were forced to attend Indian boarding schools where they experienced years of physical, mental, emotional, and sexual abuse. Similar to what happened in Canada, the schools were part of a state effort to assimilate the children and dispossess them of tribal nations and land. So far, 74 grave sites have been documented at the more than 500 institutions. No U.S. president has ever formally apologized for the boarding schools and the removal of Native American children that also included Alaskan and Hawaiian Indigenous children. Cody Grote is Mohawk and an assistant professor at the Department of History and the Indigenous Studies program at Western University in London, Ontario.
I think it's an important milestone in United States history. I think one thing that's really important for us to understand is presidential apologies are so much more rare than apologies we see here in Canada on behalf of the Prime Minister. I think this is one of only 3 or 4 presidential apologies to ever be issued. So the fact that it is for something so significant as Indian boarding schools, I think is a huge milestone in the future of United States Indigenous relations. We're 88 days left in the Biden administration, and I think we have 2 things happening. If you look at the press release from the White House, it's very much framed as a Biden-Harris accomplishment. So some of it is setting the stage for Kamala Harris. Perhaps it's trying to encourage some votes from Native Americans in the lead up to the election. But we also see Joseph Biden redefining his legacy, or trying to define his legacy very clearly. And he's making much more bolder actions in these last few months of his presidency. So I think it's a mix of those. But of course, the influence of Secretary of the Interior Deb Haaland, the first Native American to be appointed to the presidential cabinet, we can't deny that. She's been working since 2021 on the Federal Indian Boarding School Initiative.
Now to the East Coast in Eskasoni First Nation, where CTV Atlantic caught up with an Indigenous artist who makes beautiful pottery. She uses the art form to connect to her roots and help others connect to it too. CTV's Daryl Reeves brings us the story.
I use pottery as storytelling, to tell about who I am, about my culture. I find a lot of people want to know more about Indigenous culture, and that's a way for people to come and break the barrier to ask questions. So I use a lot of storytelling, traditional pots or sculptural pots that might talk about a myth. I use a lot of Mi'kmaq hieroglyphics, so people want to know about that, and that brings up conversations about who I am and about my culture. These are some of my pieces. This one is our Avits. I don't know if with the Mi'kmaq woman we wear peaked hats. So she's my peaked hat woman. And I would go and I would interview women, and from that conversation I would come and create a piece. But one of the common themes was how we put ourselves down, right? We're not good enough mothers, we're not good enough this, we should have did this better, that better. So it's about the scars that we create in ourselves. Another one I have is this one. It's still a work in progress, but it's called Carrying Life Waters. So this is going to be the sweet grass coming down like a river. It's part of my Cebu, or river series, and it's the women carrying the life waters. The difference between traditional pottery and regular pottery that I do is with the traditional, I collect my own clay. So this is some of the clay that I have that comes from right below my studio. I call it Castle Bay Res Mud. But I would harvest my own clay, I'd process it. It would be all hand-built, and then traditionally fired outside, no kiln involved. The smoke talks through the pot, so that really kind of hit me, because when you look at it, everyone is different, because it's almost like looking at clouds sometimes, like, oh, I see this, I see that, and so people can bring their own and see their own thing in each pot.
Beautiful work, Nancy. We now want to give you a recap of this week's web poll questions. The first question: do you understand why chiefs at the Assembly of First Nations voted to renegotiate an agreement on reforming the on-reserve child welfare system? Your answers are yes, no, or need more information. Next, we asked, do you feel your First Nation is ready to take control of child welfare? Yes, no, or unsure. And the third question: would you feel comfortable with a nuclear waste disposal site near your drinking water if they said all safety regulations were met? Those answers, yes, no, or unsure. You can weigh in on these questions by visiting our website at aptnnews.ca. Our Dennis Ward is up next to bring you this week's Truth in Politics panel. That chat in less than 3 minutes. Stay with us. Starting on the East Coast, St. John's 15, Charlottetown 9. Happy Valley Goose Bay +1, Cartwright 2. Saguenay 4, Val-d'Or 5. Ottawa 7, Sault Ste. Marie 9. Sudbury 7, Sioux Lookout 5. God's Lake 3, Thompson 0. 5 in Gimli, Barons River 6. Estevan -1, Saskatoon -4. -1 in La Ronge, Buffalo Narrows 0. +4 in Fort McMurray with sun, Fort Chipewyan 0. 7 in Calgary, Red Deer 8. Rain in Tofino at 14, Penticton 10. 1 in Fort Nelson, Dees Lake -2. -2 in Whitehorse, -8 in Mayo. -5 in Yellowknife, Wrigley -5 as well. -5 in Colville Lake, Inuvik -7. Chesterfield -4, Whale Cove -4 as well. And -6 in Clyde River, Aglulik -4. There is a big question mark around what is going to happen with the First Nations child welfare reform 1 week after a vote to reject the proposed $47.8 billion settlement. In fact, few are even willing to speak about it, turning down interview requests and only issuing statements. Our Truth in Politics panel is, however, willing to talk about the vote and what happens next. Jennifer Lewitz is a partner with Pasqua Harbor Strategies, and joining us this week is Andre Baer, a board member of the First Nations Child and Caring Society. They both recently spoke with our Dennis Ward. Have a listen.
Jennifer, Andre, thanks for being with us this week. Special thanks for helping out, Andre. We'll start with you as you spoke at the Special Chiefs Assembly last week, and mentioned that you thought the final settlement agreement continued discrimination against First Nations children. Maybe a little on that and your thoughts on the deal being rejected.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think all of our experts had agreed that if we accepted the deal as is, discrimination of our children would have continued for many reasons. And I highlighted a little bit in my speech, but I think it was clear that Ontario had a greater interest. They had more lobbying power because their lawyers were negotiating the deal. And so we've seen that their remoteness factors were potentially higher than other remoteness bands. And so that's great for Ontario and for their children. But this is the point of the agreement, is to end discrimination for all children, right? And so I really hope that Ontario has their own deal someday. But as for all the other regions across Canada, I think we need to find something that is more reflective of the needs of all of our children. And I think we need certainty when it comes to the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal orders, and having those orders become the floor, and then we negotiate up from there.
Jennifer, it's been a week since the vote. The National Chief hasn't spoken to media yet about this. Indigenous Services Minister Patty Hajdu hasn't done any interviews. Seems to be a lot of questions about what happens next. What do you think has been going on over the past week, I guess?
I think there's been a lot of confusion over what happens next. I think it almost feels like the AFN and the government are just saying, well, you guys figure it out then. And it's like our chiefs and leadership across the country are being treated like they made the wrong mistake by the AFN and Canada because they were fighting for a better deal. And I think that was one of the biggest issues in the room, is that the chiefs and leadership just felt like they were not consulted on enough and that it was too urgent. That was one of the number one things I was hearing was, why the urgency? Why the urgency? Like, we know that this deal, has been coming off of a decision made in the makes of over 2 decades. Like, this is not a new thing. And on the stage, I heard the AFN lawyers say, this isn't new. We've been working at this for so long, for over 5 years. Well, then why the lack of consultation, and why now the urgency? We know that there's an ever-changing political climate, but why should that affect, at the end of the day, the services and the agreement that our children from CARE deserve?
Andre, both you and Jennifer were in the child welfare system. What do you think needs to happen to ensure First Nations children on reserve are no longer discriminated against in this system?
I think that if there's ever going to be a time in our history or in our future that we ever see statutory funding, I think this is the moment. I think this is the time where statutory funding is required to ensure that no First Nations children are discriminated against within the child welfare system. And I don't think that the number, it could have been $50 billion, it could have been $60 billion. But the point is, we need something that is certainty in law. And to me, that's statutory funding for First Nations children to ensure that discrimination of them never happens again.
Jennifer, what do you see politically happening here next? A lot was made of a possible election looming. There's clearly a divide amongst chiefs over this deal. What do you think is going to happen next?
You know what, I don't know. I know that there is obviously a lot of concern with the change of government potentially coming, and it is very unfortunate that as First Nations people, what happens at a federal level, even provincially, affects us. And it's like we have to bend over backwards to make these deals happen as quickly as possible and to work with the new incoming governments. And it's almost like starting relationships over again. Even though it's supposed to be a nation-to-nation agreement with Canada, there are those political divides in there and those dynamics that we have to continuously work through. And it's frustrating, and I feel bad for our leadership that constantly have to deal with new people and lobbyists to even form these relationships and get things done.
Andre, you, like I said, had grown up in the child welfare system, and there was a lot of confusion, I think, made last week, or maybe on purpose or not, but that, the $23 billion in compensation that is going to be going to children and their families who grew up in the system or were impacted, that money wasn't going to flow. Can you maybe straighten that out for us and confirm, that's a different thing, that money is still, that program's moving forward?
Yeah, so I didn't grow up in the system. My mom was fortunate enough to sober up long enough to get me back, but I was in and out of care. However, the compensation is out the door. So the $23 billion that is for children that were discriminated against is going to come. That's already out the door. And I think there was a lot of fear mongering during the at the AFN saying that the compensation might be impacted, when in reality it had nothing to do with the compensation that was already out the door. This was specific to long-term reform.
Jennifer, your thoughts on that? Do you think that there was this was maybe purposely done, making it seem as though there wasn't going to be any compensation for those in the child welfare system if this $47.8 billion deal was rejected?
I think so. I think there was a lot of urgency and fear mongering that was happening, and I think there was also the component of, a lot of confusion as well. Like at one point I was standing there and the votes were done for the day, and there were chiefs standing around thinking like things were going to continue. There was a lot of confusion, and that was unfortunate. And I actually heard from a chief as we were walking out, he's like, I don't even know what just happened. And they're like, did we just vote that down? Like it was like there was so much confusion. And if I'm confused and everyone next to me is confused, that's a problem. And that tells me that not only were things confusing at the AFN assembly, but also everything leading up to it where there wasn't proper enough communication. And don't get me wrong, the AFN were hosting these, long Zoom meetings, but it's still, at the end of the day, I sat on those Zoom meetings and I was still confused. There was a lot of confusion, and I think there was a lot of wording to place that responsibility back on the leadership, saying, you voted for this. You wanted to do this with the agenda. This is what you asked for. And it's almost like they were doing that to build their argument for themselves that they could fight back on this, and the leadership that called them out if they wanted to.
Jennifer, Andre, we'll have to leave it there, but thanks so much for being with us this week.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dennis. And that's your midday newscast for this Friday, October 25th. Sav Jones will be here in a few hours for your evening newscast. Make sure to join us then. From everyone at APTN National News, Masicho, Hai Hai Miigwech. Thank you for watching. We'll see you again. Ekse.